the key to a high performing team is to find that talent early and cultivate it and make it talent density across the organization as soon as you can while you're operating. And so for us, we really kind of thought about talent through the life cycle of an employee, how to source talent, how to interview talent, how to close and incentivize talent, how to develop and performance manage talent, and then, of course, how to retain talent for the long term. And so Jake and I were kind of just talking ahead of this, and we have a couple of fun stories and experiences through every part of that journey. And I'll admit we were quite naive before and candidly still naive now, but more than happy to share our experiences kind of over those different stages.
Welcome to this 5th episode of the Build series with Jake and Cyrus from Clariti Software. In this episode, we talk through all things value creation through team and the role of the talented team in a growing and evolving company. And they go into a whole bunch of different topics around the foundations of that, hiring and evaluating that team and talent, and then refining, coaching, and kind of how incentives over time change as well. There's a whole bunch to dive into here.
Hi, Alex. Hi, Aaron. Happy to be with you both. By the way, happy Valentine's Day. Hope you both have some good plans.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Thanks.
Indeed, yes.
Speaking of people we love, Cyrus and Jake, I think are folks both Aaron and I hold close to our hearts, important company in our portfolios, and have really loved working with these guys. And I think as I was listening to the episode, why that is really clear. Really sharp guys, really thoughtful about running their company. Really thoughtful about the team and the people they've surrounded themselves at Clariti. This was really fun to listen to.
Yeah, this is an interesting one for both of us, right? These were self-funded searchers. Obviously, we often focus on funded search, but these were two folks that had a deal turfed up, and we started working with them. It's been a real honor to be involved with this company and on its board for a little over 5 years, and have a chance to work with a number of folks at Pacific Lake too, Keith and Chris and Jack. And it's been, I think, a real team effort. A couple things that they highlight here that Jake and Cyrus highlight here that I thought were so relevant. One was just the arc of using equity incentives to incentivize their team, where we see often that upfront, people might not know your strategy. They don't know what the value of the company is going to be. They may authentically be interested in cash compensation. And as Jake and Cyrus built a strategy, built an even more senior leadership team, equity incentives became more relevant. And, you can foresee even a next horizon of that with companies where, broader equity participation becomes something that's an important part of the compensation scheme. And I just love how they talk about the development of that. There were executives, at this company and at any company that were the exact right person for the size the company was when they bought it. And then there was a need to, re-envision who was going to lead that function as it scaled, as they've had so much growth at Clariti, as the number of direct reports for those positions increased. And just being really thoughtful about right seat, right person, right culture fit. And it's just the case that they've put together a truly world-class executive team that I know we're all really proud of.
Absolutely. Yeah, the theme here really is around evolution, right? They talk about evolving the team from 25 employees 5 years ago to 125 people today. Talk about a talent journey. And I think the two examples you shared are great ones about how, as the company grows and evolves, so too does the talent strategy. And I think they were, share a lot of great examples and stories about that they've experienced with Clariti. So overall, I think a really great podcast. Lots of things for our listeners to learn.
And Alex, we'll see if it makes the final cut. I hear Cyrus might have some half Ironman plans this year. So it's a early part of the year, time for good goal setting. Before the reality of our work lives have hit us yet, see what you can get out of him on his triathlon plans.
Yeah, evolution's everywhere, both physically and, we're just had Valentine's Day, a lot of relationships evolving or devolving, in different ways. So a lot of change ahead for everybody here. Jake and Cyrus, good to see you both and have you on the 5th episode of the Build series on all about the role of talent in fast-growing companies. And you've had a lot of experience adding tons of talent to Clariti, so this is going to be a ton of fun. Could you talk a little bit about Clariti and what the business looked like when you got there, and the early role of talent as the business went from 25 employees to 100 plus today?
Yeah. It's great to be on again, Alex. So thank you for having us. The Clarity journey has definitely not been a straight line, and the timing is really good for this podcast, as Jake and I were reflecting that we just crossed the 5-year mark of kind of being with the Clarity business since January of 2020. So I think to your point, joining the organization when it was about 20 people and just starting to get our first kind of grasp as to what does high performance look like in a small growing business, I think has evolved pretty significantly as to, today running a 120 person organization and having an executive team, having a management team, having different cascading layers and what that means. And so I think for us, along that journey, we've come to realize that like the key to a high performing team is to find that talent early and cultivate it and make it talent density across the organization as soon as you can while you're operating. And so for us, we really kind of thought about talent through the life cycle of an employee, how to source talent, how to interview talent, how to close and incentivize talent, how to develop and performance manage talent, and then of course how to retain talent for the long term. And so Jake and I were kind of just talking ahead of this, and we have a couple of fun stories and experiences through every part of that journey. And I'll admit we were quite naive before, and candidly still naive now, but more than happy to share our experiences kind of over those different stages.
Yeah, the life cycle will be really fun to dive into, and it's a good progression of thoughts down along the talent journey. So we should definitely dive into that. But just before doing that, what was your thinking around the role of talent early on, and how did you kind of get to understand the team you had and where talent was and kind of where you wanted it? What was that kind of maybe like the first, like going from 20 people to 40? Like, what was that journey like?
Yeah. Um, I mean, it's so, so important. And we listened to, all the podcasts, read all the management books we could as we were jumping into being first time CEOs. And everything and everyone told us, it's all about the people. And that was extremely true when we were 20 people. And it stays true today, being 100 plus. For us, it was really just getting to know the people in the business as we joined it. And so Cyrus and I met with every single employee one-on-one right away, got a sense of, what they were excited about in the business, what they thought challenges were. And as we talked through that with them, I think, we kind of came into 3 camps, like people who are really excited about Cyrus and I joining and the growth story, we were bringing into Clarity, people who, were maybe uncomfortable about the change. And then frankly, people who just didn't really care. Like, oh, Jake and Cyrus are here. That's great. And so you kind of like quickly find out like who's really excited about the growth journey. And to people in all those camps, you have to prove, why you're here. And really at the end of the day, it's to help grow the business, grow their careers. And so, when in the software build business we're in, people build our product, people sell our product, people implement our product. It's really all about people at the end of the day. And so people were so, so critical in our early journey. And so it was kind of about finding who are the champions that want to help you thrive and help build the business, and what are the key roles that you need. And then, if you don't have those folks internally, having to look externally, especially as you have pretty big growth targets, you of course need to build the team to meet those targets. So that was kind of the early days for us, and just a lot of learning in that period.
And within that, before kind of sourcing talent externally, how did you source your internal talent and identify kind of the rising stars that um, can become like larger pieces of the team over time? Like, how did that initial kind of almost like insourcing talent versus, looking outwards? How did those internal kind of talent evaluations, like who can play a big role in this company as we grow? Like, how did that discussion and work and evaluation go?
Well, I think that's one of the advantages of having a small, lean team where, with 20 people, you're really working alongside everyone. You know everyone on a first name basis. Over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, you're typically exposed to everyone at the organization in some way, shape, or form. And so to Jake's point, it was as simple as having those one-on-ones and having people ask us, like, what are your growth plans? How can we contribute? How can we support? Where you have that initial inclination of, oh, like this person's really excited about the growth we have ahead. Or it can be some of the kind of ad hoc special projects that you don't have a team for at the time of like, does anyone want to help with this employee survey? Or does anyone want to help put together the town hall content? Or does anyone want to help research this market? and seeing the individuals that are being proactive, raising their hands, kind of starts to get a feel. And so I think there's through some of those kind of initial feelings for the first few months, you start to delegate and empower a few kind of people that keep raising their hand. And then you start to get a sense of, oh, these are individuals that really want to drive the business forward, not just through their kind of day-to-day tasks. And I think that's how we kind of identified some of those initial champions at Clariti who, 5 years later are still with us today and doing really well.
And so priming for sourcing talent externally, what has been your strategy over the last few years? And what are some kind of parts and pieces of that sourcing talent life cycle stage for each employee? What does that look like today?
Well, I think the thing we always laughed about on the sourcing talent side is like you have no brand when you get into the business. Typically, you have no background of sourcing or hiring people. And so there's a lot of like net new creation that needs to take place. I think Jake and I were fortunate where we came from, tech businesses that had great recruiting processes. And so we were able to kind of implement a couple of additional kind of, processes to get started. But really the early days of sourcing talent whereas leveraging our personal professional network, looking into the industry, and what I'd call seed planning. I think the best kind of consideration to think about is when you're searching for a proprietary business, you're often reaching out to owners that have no interest for 6, 12, 18, 24 months. And it's the same thing with sourcing high profile talent. I think Jake and I reached out to every CEO, CRO, CMO in our industry along our competitions, knowing that they'd have no interest in joining us at the stage. But at some point in time, as they see our progress over the few years, they'll eventually come back and they'll eventually get interested. And so I kind of vividly remember, we'd wrap up our day and then at like 9 p.m. after dinner, we'd both go on LinkedIn and we'd just be kind of cold outreaching industry people that looked like they had great backgrounds for intro calls and coffee chats, just to kind of plant those seeds for talent down the road. And to our surprise, some of those people actually responded with interest up front. And I think a big part of that sourcing at the starting point, which we talked about before, Alex, was it's not really selling them on the company yet because the company hasn't done much yet, but it's selling them on the vision of what you plan to do with the company. And it's selling them really on yourselves as co-CEOs in our case. And I think a big part of the story was the board we've assembled behind us, the investors behind us, the power of the search fund model. And I think, a lot of the humility we have and almost the partnership approach we take to some of the initial kind of talent we bring on board where we're not directing you on this journey, you are partnering with us on this growth journey. And I think it was those early messages that really resonated in a couple of folks kind of taking interest in an earlier stage, candidly unknown company. Fast forward 5 years later, and it's amazing what traction and kind of long-term time can do where you spend 5 years in an industry and suddenly all of your competitors turn over, new private equity owners, a bunch of your competitors go through exits, a bunch of your competitors see the traction you have in market, and then you start to get more inbound talent. And then the initial talent you hire starts to refer talent in their network because they're having a great experience. And suddenly it's no longer the co-CEO sourcing on LinkedIn. And now it's a lot of those seeds you planted in the early stages coming back to you. And it's a lot of the key talent in your team bringing talent that they know to your organization. And that's how I think sourcing has really scaled in our organization.
What is that, like the winning cures everything? Growth and momentum like fixes a lot of problems. Sounds pretty familiar.
Revenue solves all problems, and so I would say that you can really feel the traction if you're kind of gaining progress and momentum over a period of time in an industry, and we've really felt that over the years.
Well, early on with some of those, so when it's just 20, 30 employees and company hasn't done much, like what are some common objections you'd hear from like the most talented prospects? And like, how did you address them or talk through them and explain what you're trying to do when there's a less visible traction for the company?
Yeah, I think one of the more difficult things when you're that small, honestly, is it depends on the market and industry you're in, but is compensation expectations as a small company, with a relatively smaller P&L, it's a lot harder to pay, of course, top of market, but even in some cases, right at market. And so, and that's just really tough for people because, of course, people are in different life stages, come from different expectations. You want someone who's going to take you to the next level, but of course, they want the comp at that next level. And so that's evolved for us over the years and learning around that. But that's definitely really tough early on is just, can you, if you can't meet the market compensation, well, what other things can you bring? And so as Cyrus mentioned, of course, like selling them on the vision and impact, especially at 20 people. And impact is huge. Like, people really do want their work to be meaningful. That's, for a lot of people, why they join a small company. It can relate to your mission, what you're trying to do in the market. And as well, just frankly, Cyrus and I being young and energetic, certainly not experienced to the level of CEOs they might have worked with at the time. But even just saying, we're new to this, we're new to learning as well, and just being genuine and transparent, I think that really helped us sell people early on, because I don't know how transparent people are, in most companies they come from, but Cyrus and I have always led from the start there. And so where we can't win with traction or comp, we really do, especially in those early days, have to overemphasize on the impact that they can have, and leading a team or growing into that really quickly. And so a lot on the career development is where we'd get people excited.
The only thing I would add to that is, I think, in absence of maybe Jake and I having credibility from the start, we really leveraged our board in those early days to kind of have the board demonstrate credibility to these high profile talent candidates, where they're able to speak to their experiences, their trust in kind of Jake and myself, and that went a long way. And then, second, I think just being, vulnerable with kind of, Jake and I in the early days. I think there's always this question around titling. And I think titling is a two-way sword where, sometimes we'd have people that came from 100 or 200 person organizations where they were a manager or a director. So coming to our organization, we said, we're a smaller org, you can come as a senior manager or senior director. And often given them that incremental title, made them kind of feel like they had more autonomy and ownership going into our business. But the two-way sword is, as your organization scales, if you're being treated as a director versus a manager, our expectations for you are also higher. And so the higher title you have coming in, the higher we expect you as the organization grows. And so that's just, I think, something to keep in mind, where some people run into problems where if you hire, 10 VPs when you're 20 people, and then you get to 100 people, are those VPs now the VPs of your 100-person company? And so I think titles is something that we've gotten right, we've gotten wrong, but I think it's another kind of key criteria to keep in mind as you're thinking about these different chips you have on your table when you're sourcing early talent.
Yeah, can you talk more about the titling piece? Like, there's plenty of companies that will have someone titled as CFO, and then the owner describes them as a controller. Like, that happens all the time. Like, did you design like a rubric or progression guide to help explain, like, this is what a VP at Clariti means, and like, here's what the job looks like, and then as you go from that to you work your way up, here's how that evolves. Is there something more, was there a structural set of rules you established for setting titles, or was a lot of it like case by case depending on what the person was before?
Yeah, early on, it was definitely case by case. I'll be honest, Cyrus and I were trying to figure it out. And as Cyrus said, it was a lot of, using title as a form of compensation. Someone's a manager, we can probably convince them to come over. Senior manager, it shows career progression. But then, of course, you start building a people and talent team, which we haven't had an incredible leader of for the last few years with us, who starts, helping us create those frameworks and realize, a VP level is certainly different than a director level, which is certainly different than a manager level. And the expectations you have to have for them as a people manager, them in their role, and is so important. And it changes as your, size and scale grows. And so, yeah, we did have to put together more of the, what does a manager mean? What does a director mean? And, compensation levels to make sure that people have equitable compensation at the same roles. So that started to come in later years, and we, made sure everyone was treated really, really right and equitable. And today, we spend a lot of time before we interview a role to say, like, hey, what does this role need to do? Are they a builder? Are they a people manager? And what do we expect their outcomes to be? And spend a lot of time on, what does that mean the title should be for the business, versus, I think, before it was, what does this person need in their title to join us? So it's much more structural, equitable, and I think a lot better process now that we've scaled.
The other thing I'd just add there that, Jake, I think we've done a reasonably good job of is, whenever we hire someone that's joining at the kind of highest tier of the company at the time, whether that's like our first director, our first senior director, our first VP, we will kind of fight to make sure that they come in at the level just before that, with our commitment that we are going to promote them in 6 to 12 months if they meet the performance standards. And that allows us to show the organization how we set the bar for that talent, where kind of that talent gets internally promoted and gets set as the bar for, this is the bar for what this entails. And I think kind of doing that internally versus bringing it from outside makes the organization see that like that promotion has been vetted from Jake and myself. And the idea of like who we promote to those levels, I think just helps set the bar for the organization on standards that we expect.
It's an interesting nuance in the kind of internal facing value of titles and setting promotions as a benchmark standard or quality standard. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Can you expand on that?
The lowest common denominator of the title is the benchmark that people use for that title. And so if you have 3 directors that have completely different years of experience and completely different performance standards, everyone that's looking for the director promotion will look to the person with the lowest years of experience or the lowest performance standards. And so that's where, when we have our first hired director or first hired VP, Jake and I spend a lot of time to make sure that that individual meets the bar across all standards, because that is going to set the new bar for how people think about getting promoted to that level. And so that's, I think, the level of thought we kind of put into those types of roles, where we just want to make sure the bar is very clear to the team, and every person who hits that role is meeting that bar.
I love that. You also mentioned leaning on your board for getting a couple senior hires and telling the story a little bit more fully. What are some effective ways you found of getting your board and broader investor group involved in that recruiting?
When we figure out like this is the role we need in the organization, especially for senior roles, oftentimes Cyrus and I will send them to our board and our investor group with an ask of, hey, this is the role, this is what we're looking for. Do you know anyone? And so we use them from the early stages of sourcing talent, just to see, do they have any referrals, great people that we could bring into the interview process. And especially early on, we use the board in the interview process. So typically, Cyrus and I would have, especially for senior levels, assignments or presentations, and we bring the board in to see that, to kind of see like what is that senior leader's executive presence and what they'd expect there. And then for kind of like selling the candidate on joining us and closing them, Cyrus and I have also used the board to, send out emails to them and reach out and offer time and say, huge congrats on getting an offer. Cyrus and Jake loved you through the process, and would be super happy to jump on a call with you and share why I'm so excited about being on the board of Clariti. And so the board has been really instrumental to us throughout it all. And that's one of the, great things we hear from candidates who decide to join us is like, I've never seen a board member reach out and say, hey, congrats, and willing to jump on a call. And many of our team members do that. And so, we of course have to keep the capacity of the board in mind, but in hiring and especially in growth mode, the board was so aligned that that's been our priority. And so they've been amazing at supporting that through the years.
Did you set any expectations like that with your board early on? Like in selecting board members for Clariti, did you say like, we want you involved in hiring and recruiting in these ways? If you're excited about that, we'd love to have you as a board member. Was that a conversation that happened?
I think we're both smiling because we weren't that thoughtful, I think, early on. I think it was more organic than us being deliberate about it. That being said, I think we were grateful where, between a combination of having boards for the search fund ecosystem and having board members that were within our industry, we had just a board that had a very broad talent network that I think played to our favor. And then the combination of domain experience and historical search success, I think, just played a really positive story to prospective talent. And so I wish Jake and I were that thoughtful ahead of time. But yes, if we were to do it again, having a board with a broad talent network that can resonate with your kind of key talent profile you're trying to hire, I think is a great thing to consider.
And lastly, before jumping over to interviewing and that stage of the life cycle, in the later years or later days, once you now have traction and there's a lot more kind of proof in the pudding for different roles and big new customers and whatnot, what tends to win talent in like today, like this year, like what for this year in 2025, like what is going to be your sourcing and kind of talent winning strategy?
It's definitely changed over the years, and I think for, any company in any industry, no matter what, you need to energize your existing talent and your net new on what your mission is. And for us, we're in the permitting and licensing space, and so, um, that can, mean various things to people, but ultimately, at the end of the day, building permitting is our core, and what that means is making housing grow and making it more affordable because we're increasing the supply of housing by reducing permitting time. And so we, first off, spin that into a sexy way to say it of we make housing more affordable. And we really do believe in that mission. And that's, I'd say, like one way. And, for any CEO or company, whatever your mission is, the person leading it is, of course, passionate about it. You have to find ways to make others passionate about it and something that they can connect with. And so for us, that is definitely today as we scale, people do want to join a company that has a meaningful mission. And so that is a core part of how do we get people excited and show, momentum in what we're doing or why we're doing what we're doing. And then, of course, there's the actual growth. Like, I think in today's day and age, um, it, employees are just very smart. Like, they want to know, what is the company's traction? Is it profitable? Is it going to be sustainable? Do you have the capital base? Do you have the board behind you? And so, and I think that sophistication is great because, of course, we've had, many years in the business to build upon that, but it's definitely like, hey, this is how much we're growing. We're really transparent people. Our capital base is fantastic. Our board is fantastic. In fact, let me have them give you a call right after this. But that's really, a way that we've been able to get that conviction is by being transparent, sharing numbers, by sharing the mission and the why, and then offering to them of like, hey, you can connect with any of our leadership team members while you're in this process. If you have questions, and our leadership team members, of course, are people we've hired on or have grown over time that are energized by all those things, by the mission, by who we are and what we do. And so I think we're at a lucky point where, because we're growing well, because we have a mission driven business, because we have a great group of talent, it's become a lot easier to hire people than it was in the early days of saying, hey, we're Jake and Cyrus. I swear we'll grow one day. Please join us. And so, yeah, we're able to use a lot more variables today to get someone excited.
And then for like kick off the interviewing stage, so that part of that life cycle, once you've identified like a handful of candidates and you have a good sense for, I guess you're going to develop a sense for like what the role needs. But how does that interviewing stage begin for you?
Yeah, we've also evolved that over time as we've learned. But I'll even say, like, in defining the job, like, it's so critical whoever is hiring for it. So say if it's Cyrus and I, and we ask the team and cascade this down, but like, really three things up front. Like, what is the mission of that job, and make it super clear. What are the outcomes of that job? 3 to 5 ideally outcomes of where that person or individual would drive outcomes to end of year. And then, what are the competencies to be able to effectively be in that role? That's super critical to us to define before we even get to job description and job qualifications. And, from there, we do define, okay, now that we've all aligned and circulated that and are good with the mission and outcomes and competencies we need, now let's get more specific on the responsibilities, on the qualifications, and as you called out here, on the interview stages. And so those do differ on the interview stages themselves. It does depend on the seniority of the role and, how many interview rounds are there and the types of interview rounds. And in general, we'll always have, upfront application reviews, phone screen, followed by typically a hiring manager screen, and then, potentially a deep dive into that specific role and their experiences there. And then we follow that up with a pretty lengthy, we call it functional interview, but it has the tenets of top grading interview, of really getting deep on their prior career experiences. And then, for more senior roles, we'll have an assignment or case presentation and close it out with a culture interview. Um, and so, and move to offer and all the rest. But yeah, the amount of stages, I will say, Cyrus and I probably do more than the average person. And I know it's become popular, or at least was a few years ago, of like, you should know within 2 conversations if you're going to hire someone. I think you learn a lot through the interview process. You need time with an individual, and you need to make sure the right people are spending the right time. You're only going to learn so much. You can actually learn a lot from references and people that have worked through them, or back channeling. And so we do, I would say a lot of external interview stages, as well as a lot of behind the scenes, to really get conviction on candidates. And it's just so, so important to get the right person in the seat.
You mentioned setting outcomes for this role. Uh, How do you go about doing that? Like, what would be an example of a good outcome to set, and what's a less useful outcome to set?
Yeah, happy to give an example. And so, for at the highest level, like, setting an outcome needs to be super clear on, did you achieve that or not, whether it's binary or, clear that you can track the progress across the year. And I'll give an example, top of mind. We hired in a executive vice president of customer experience. And for her, it was super clear we needed to do 3 things in the first year with her here. And for that role, we're building a whole new function of customer experience, which for us encapsulated customer success, customer support, and professional services. So it's a big leadership role to oversee those functions. And so the first outcome for us was, we need you to spend time in the seat and then design the org chart for what year end looks like for those sub functions, having the right seats and the right people in those seats. And so, number one, have a super clear org design. And number two, customer journey, really being clear on what the touch points are across the customer journey and what that looks like across each of our products, and therefore defining the customer segments we have, and having that as an output that, is signed off by Cyrus, myself, and the leadership team, and we're actually using that customer journey. And then third, and this is just top of mind, I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot more, but the top three, the third was KPI metrics, like designing a dashboard for customer experience, including KPIs, capturing the baselines, capturing where you want to be by year end, and agreeing on that as well. And so it's, to go back to it, like, what we realized is those were the things we needed in the role, as we needed to grow that new function and get that senior leader in there. And why did we need a senior leader? Well, we needed someone with the experience of designing the right org, of designing a full end-to-end customer journey, and of, having the experience of creating strong metrics, creating a dashboard to track those. And so really needed someone that was special with the build capability as well as the people management capabilities. And so, yeah, just, I guess I got pretty specific there, but we do get really specific in the outcomes we want to drive for a role.
Yeah, I mean, specifics are great. So please have at them. Um, how do you, as CEOs, involve yourself in a hiring and interviewing? Well, or hire this is all about hiring, but the interview itself. How do you involve yourself as a CEO in interviewing? Whether it's you know high end high managers, C level, or anyone else in the company. Where do you insert yourself?
Yeah, this has definitely changed from the early days to later days. When we're 20 people, Jake and I are interviewing everyone to the organization, whether it's a entry level technical support analyst or a senior manager for marketing. We're generally involved primarily in like the functional, I would say, interview process, but also kind of involved in the cultural element as well, since we're still defining the culture for the company. So the culture is really resting with Jake and myself. And on the functional side, it's usually Jake and I that are kind of driving the desire for those new roles. I think as the organization has grown, we have now documented and trained the organization and set the example for what a strong culture means in an organization. And so now we have, culture champions that are all outperforming in our culture matrix that are allowed to do our culture interviews for our organization. And the functional interviews are now driven by the leaders of those departments because those leaders now have more functional expertise in those areas than Jake and I do. Where Jake and I are most heavily involved now is on the executive leaders and on the management team members. And, back to like the analogy between this and proprietary searching for like a search fund business, people always debate how much time do you spend with the business up front before, deciding like a go or no go on it. And for executive roles, Jake and I will actually just do a 30-minute kind of almost coffee chat call with individuals just to get them excited about the organization. If we're finding these like high potential, high prospect individuals, before we jump into grilling them about everything to do with, their background and expertise, we actually spend a lot of time up front where we build a personal relationship. They get to know how we think and we feel. And then we give them the option of, hey, you've gotten to know us. Do you want to participate in this process or not? And so I think we kind of do a multi-touch, extra special approach to those executive team members, knowing kind of the magnitude of impact that they could potentially have for the organization. And so at the executive level, we're involved in multiple stages of that process. At the management level, the executive really drives the process, but Jake and I are there for the culture interview to make sure we agree with the executive's decision.
What are some good culture questions you've been using or started using that have been most helpful for you?
So the way that we structure our culture interview is we actually list out the core values for our organization, and then we have questions that support each of those core values. And so, like as an example of like learning constantly, we'll just ask someone, "What's the last thing you learned recently, and can you teach us it?" And their kind of approach to thinking through something that they're learning, whether it's, I don't know, how to play chess better, or it's how to be a better project manager, and then their ability to eloquently explain to us how they've gone about learning it and how to kind of teach us, just gives us a good sense of like how much does this person think about learning, and how do they kind of think about learning in their own way. Whereas when it comes to courageous communication, which is this whole idea of making sure you have a voice of how you feel, irrespective of your role or your level or how uncomfortable the conversation is. What's a time you had to courageously communicate with your senior or to a customer? And what was the situation that led you to have to take that kind of courageous communication, and what was the outcome of that? And so I think we often go to kind of situational questions or questions of kind of their past experiences tying to those core values. And that's how we kind of get a sense of how well do these people kind of interface with the core values of our organization.
Are there any common questions that folks like to ask that you've found actually are not very helpful or that you've stopped using recently? What's been cut? What got cut?
Yeah, we've definitely iterated over time, and we have a standard list of questions now, but every hiring manager will adjust it specifically to their role. And I'm trying to think about questions that we've cut. Cyrus, I don't know if any come to mind. I think culturally we've kept them pretty consistent because we've kept our cultural identity fairly consistent. I think as it comes to more functional interviews, understanding about them and their experiences, I think things like how do you collaborate with, other stakeholders in these roles? It's pretty easy to talk about like, oh yeah, I work well with sales and marketing, and I was able to, do a campaign with them and support them as a product manager. Like everyone can say they collaborate well. And so I think we've tried to avoid like the things that if you ask yourself the question, can you easily answer this without any, specific way to pick out like, is this person someone that I know can really get into the trenches and deal with this? I think we've just gotten better with generally getting the right types of questions. But Cyrus, I don't know if you have any top of mind that we've been like, let's ask that question that, can't be asked anymore.
Yeah, building on that, to your point, I think sometimes we take that superficial response and we'd say, okay, and we kind of write it down, and then we debrief and be like, well, we didn't really get an answer there. I think we've trained ourselves in the team to just call it an interview. We got to dig deeper there. Okay, like what does collaborating with product mean? Like what does it mean when you supported the marketing manager here? Like get us into the names, the specifics, like what actually took place. And so I think we push a lot more in interviews to get to really quality answers versus the fluff of, this project and it went great. Okay, the project went great. Let's move on.
Yeah, can you talk more about that? Because it's easy for to take a very disciplined approach and try to quantify as much as possible, get lots of examples, but it's easy if you do a lot of interviews to start kind of drifting away from that and being okay with like, okay, the superficial like story, like, yep, we'll write that down. What are some like kind of self-correcting mechanisms you have to keep that quantitative force and investigation within your interview process, especially as you now have lots of other executives doing interviews that you're not a part of as much anymore?
Two things, I think. Number one, we have like programmed interview training for kind of all individuals in the organization that kind of highlights a couple of these kind of key considerations beyond just the questions and the format of the interview for them to keep in mind. Two, in the debrief process, you know, in almost, I think in all cases, there's always an executive or Jake and I in a debrief for like a candidate. And so I think another thing we've learned is to move away from like feeling and to go with like, well, what was the example that illustrated this, right? And so when someone says, yeah, I felt like they were a relentless builder, the executive that asks, well, what was the example and what did they drive to demonstrate, relentless building? And so I think that kind of constant iteration within even the interviewing panel keeps it kind of top of mind for people. That is a really important aspect for them to verify over the process.
And so having multiple people in the interview also has it sounds like it has a check and balance dynamic to it as well.
Totally. Yeah. It is never one party throughout the interview process. There's most often 3, sometimes 4 people that are involved in an interview process, start to finish.
And so now that you've identified someone that you like, how do you close? What's your close?
So Jay kind of covered it earlier on, but we kind of joke like about the swarm approach, right? So we like swarm the board on them, we like swarm the executives on them, we like swarm the peers on them. And this is something that's also noteworthy that we can only really do with the board early on, but in these days, what's even more powerful we find is like when their peers reach out to say, hey, congratulations, heard you got this role. I've been with the organization for a year. Let's jump on a call. Because it's one thing for the CEO who's selling you, or even the board that's arguably somewhat removed from the business to say, hey, this is a great organization. But when you're the, in Jake's example, the EVP of, customer experience, and then the EVP of finance and the EVP of sales and the VP of marketing reach out to you and offer a call, and there's kind of peer-to-peer information sharing of like like they're not telling you bullshit. Like, this is the experience I have. This is what I've had relative to the last companies. Here's like the honest truth of what's good and what's bad. Like that, like rapport building in the closing stage, we've kind of found to be super critical. And we've had many candidates say like, oh, like that was a real differentiator. Like it's very rare we talk to our peers in an organization before we join the company. Like you guys are really transparent, and it's cool to get a sense for like the culture and the vibe kind of through that closing process. I think Jake also highlighted like the second point that we really emphasize across our organization, which is just that transparency piece. And so we are very transparent with kind of our compensation packages and our compensation bands and where those bands are kind of driven from. And I think also probably different than a lot of organizations, we're extremely transparent about our equity. And so we do everything from walking through what enterprise value means to how enterprise value has grown in the organization over time to what type of package they're receiving and what a benchmark value is for that package to based on a base case of the business growing over the next 5 years, what could that package be potentially worth? And what happens if we grow more or less? And so we also get feedback that against other organizations, folks have a really good understanding of their compensation package coming in and how that compensation package is influenced. And so I think them just seeing how we work with them through like compensation negotiations or kind of closing the process with the team, I think that really gets them the feeling of, oh, this is what the company is going to be like coming in. And we often find that those are kind of the key things to close. The final thing I'll add is, we're a remote organization. We always do our best to close the candidate in person, whether it's kind of an executive or kind of a management team member, where that kind of face-to-face interaction and almost the ceremony of taking them out for lunch or dinner and really getting to know their kind of personal life and family beyond just the interview process, I think is also kind of a good touch we use to close. I think the final piece that we'll kind of call out, and this has been like a journey for us, as Jay called out, like naturally as a 20-person organization, I think we had to pay like 25th percentile, like kind of a market. And mind you, all that's in Canadian dollars. And I think as the organization has grown, we've really advocated to hold the budget space as our business has grown to elevate our compensation bands. And so I'd say today we probably pay closer to the 50th percentile and in some special technical cases, even the 75th percentile for talent. And I think that we earn the right to pay that for talent because we really vetted our process for getting talent. If we're paying 75th percentile to a bunch of underperforming talent, that's a very bad place to be in a business. But if you have conviction that you're bringing on the right talent, you should not let compensation be the factor that stops you from great talent. I think Jake and I have been in a lot of cases where we've tried to save $2,000, $5,000, $10,000 because this talent is less expensive than the other. And in all cases, great talent is 10x plus the ROI of what that kind of incremental 5 or 10K was. And so there's been many times we've advocated to the board or to our comp benchmarking saying, hey, we think this extra 5 or 10K is worth it. And I think it's rare that we've been wrong in that, incremental excess budget to kind of support great talent. So those are like a couple of thoughts that have come to mind on how we kind of close and incentivize that talent.
Well, can you talk about that kind of push and pull? Like you have these transparent comp bands for every role, but then a great candidate is probably going to want more. Maybe they've had great results at prior roles. They want more. How do you negotiate that push and pull internally?
I mean, today we actually list the compensation bands for every single role online. So anyone who's applying for a role knows, what's the comp band. And we make it super clear, why you're at the bottom of the range or the top of the range. And we actually don't go outside of our range. So to Cyrus's point, if one candidate, maybe there's two final candidates, one is at the lower point of our range, one is at the midpoint of our range. And we will, say it's probably worth it if that midpoint candidate has more experience and can provide more for us, more value, and we think they'll do really well in the role. It's been worth going for it. But we're really clear on we don't go above budget for or above what that role is because we do want to keep equity in our organization. So we always stay within the range. And if it's a senior role, and for us, kind of director level plus has equity, we'll look at equity and just honestly spend a lot of time explaining the value of equity. Because that's another thing to Cyrus's earlier point, like that's really important is just being transparent on that because not many companies do that. And so that's where we'll try to extend. And it's honestly just information sharing. But we do keep our team members within bands just as we scale. It's so important for equity.
And to Jake's point, we made this mistake in the early days where we didn't talk about compensation early because we felt like it was something that should be kept secret. Then you spend 6 hours with someone, you get to the final stage of the interview process, and you're like, we have 150K as the band for this role. And they say, well, I was making 220K on Amazon. And then we say, well, shit, I wish we validated this earlier. And so it was a big culture change for us to like reveal compensation bands. But where we, again, have conviction is if we do benchmarking analysis against North America, we know our bands are in the 50th percentile. Why are we kind of hiding where our bands are? And naturally, you'll always get people that, are paying 75th or 90th%, looking at you, Google, Amazon, Facebook. But ultimately, beyond compensation, there's a lot more we offer to individuals beyond just that point. And so if they are optimizing for just compensation, they probably should be going to work at, Google or Facebook. But I think to Jake's point, us being transparent about that band is more about when we get to final stages, where do they fall within that band versus saying, oh, wow, we were off by 60% here.
There's a couple notes around KPIs and kind of plans for the role. So once they're excited to join the company, they've onboarded or their first couple weeks or what have you, and you're planning out what the next couple quarters or couple years look like for this role. How do you set and measure performance from there and score them against it?
Yeah. So for us, those outcomes that I mentioned at the beginning, you want to make sure you didn't just create that for the job description, that truly you are measuring, them on that. And you shared that in the interview process. And then as they join, in your very first one-on-one, or what we do in our first one-on-ones, is we build out a whole kind of onboarding plan for them in an onboarding sheet. And in that onboarding, we make it super clear of like, hey, what are we working towards? It's, these 3 outcomes or 5 outcomes that we talked about in the interview process. And in this initial 90-day period, let's help get you there. And so what Cyrus and I do for all the roles, and now everyone in an organization does as we scale, is we build out what's the 30-day plan, what's the 60-day plan, what's the 90-day plan. Of course, early on, you're learning about the organization and connecting with stakeholders. In 60 days, you're delivering, a measurable results. And in 90, you're really building the plans to get to those year-end outcomes. And now that you've learned, now that you've delivered some results. And so it's important for us to just have that transparent two-way communication and an agreement early on, and documented of this is what we expect. And it's early on, like we're pretty hands-on involved, or the hiring manager is on, it's actually our goal, like make them successful. We hired them for a reason. let's make them crush this 30 days. Let's make them crush this 60 days. Let's do everything we can to, have them hit their 90-day period. And if you're doing everything you can as a hiring manager and they're not performing, then you have to have those tough conversations. But the goal is, of course, you early on are trying to get those early success signals to see, are we taking the measurable steps to get to these outcomes that we've agreed on upon year end. And so that's kind of like the first way Cyrus and I and the org will look at it, is helping them across that journey to get to those outcomes.
The other thing I'll add is to Jake's point, like we set outcomes to hire this person. We share with them those outcomes. There's alignment through the interview processes in the starting. Our goal is to get you to these outcomes because that's how we're measuring success for you. What Jake and I also do is we make sure everyone at the organization understands the vision, the mission, the 10-year goal for the company, the 3-year strategy we're pursuing, the 1-year company priorities, and the KPIs, irrespective of the role they play in the organization. And, in the early stages of 20 people, that'd be Jake and I taking an individual for coffee and talking to them about it. In today's stage, Jake and I actually have a call after this where we're onboarding everyone who just joined the company in the last 30 days. And they spend an hour with Jake and I going through these areas. And we really have a two-way conversation about this is how we arrived at that vision. What questions do we have? This is why we set these 3-year strategic pillars. Does anyone have a sense of, questions here, or do they think differently? Because we think that beyond the individual's role that they're contributing against, we want them to understand why the company is doing what they're doing, which gives them the opportunity to raise their hand and take on more. If they know the direction the company is going, that gives them the opportunity to say, well, I know they're doing this. Can I also help here or there? And I think that just gives people the space and the context where they can even contribute beyond their roles.
So that call is happening like right after we're done here for this
That's
call?
Right.
Wow, nice. So what are you gonna say? What's like your opening quick hits? Let's practice.
I think it's important to first show gratitude, and so Jake and I first thank everyone for joining the organization and for the journey that they're about to embark on with us. Jake and I get to know everyone individually, name, hometown, role, why they joined the organization. And then we jump into why Jake and I joined Clariti, Jake and my background, and ultimately why we're here speaking with them today. And then we kind of go through that. The reason we did this is the vision of our organization. This is the mission we're all on together. Did everyone join the right company? Are we all on the same page about the mission and why we're here? And then we go through the core values of the organization and highlight how through their interview process, we were vetting them for these core values, and we've all demonstrated them. And then we get into, to get to the vision and mission, here's this kind of 10-year goal that we've set for the organization. In our case, it's serving 100 million citizens across US and Canada. And here's our progress towards that goal. And then to get to that 10-year goal, here's the 3-year strategic pillars that we're pursuing. And here are the decisions we got through to arrive to those decisions. Now that we have that 3-year, here are the 1-year milestones we're pursuing. And here's our progress towards those milestones. And when you get into our town hall next week, you're going to see these quarterly objectives. These are the stepping stones to get to that kind of annual kind of goal set. And if we accomplish all those things, we're going to get to our 10-year goal. And that's what success means for us. And so having everyone just getting that sense that they can talk about it in their own one-on-ones, they can talk about it in the group meetings, everyone has a sense of where we're going. We find that that's been really important to make sure that everyone's rowing in the same direction. And again, getting back to the high-performing team.
And a big part of that talent retention, over time, is laying out a career path within the company and making sure there's, early and quarterly and, fairly frequent wins along that journey to keep them excited and interested and engaged. How do you design a career path for somebody? What does that look like? And what are some pivots and adjustments you sometimes have to make?
Yeah. So career pathing is so important, and you can't spend enough time on it because, especially as your organization scales, it's just really like internal talent that's building that knowledge and building those experiences, building those relationships, especially really high performing ones. You want to do everything you can to show them that there's that career path. And so, now at our size and scale, we're above 100 employees. We really have defined levels and titles for every single function and job. And we have paths because some people want to just continue crushing it as an individual contributor, and some want to become a people manager. And for us, it's super important to have career paths for both, because we don't want that to, so traditionally companies have these levels that you can only get to if you're a people manager. And for us, that's a people manager path, but there's also just an individual contributor path. Some people are just amazing at the work they do. And so for us, it's about making it super clear. What are those levels? What does it take to get to those levels? So, what are the responsibilities? And to the earlier point on interviewing, what are the outcomes you need to do in that role to make expectations super clear and, playing that higher level role? And we always kind of have this like triangle that we talk about. So, of course, like when we look at role progression, you have to first evaluate like what does the business need, because you don't want to hire people into roles just because they really want it, but you actually don't have the budget or the outcomes that you need to drive that are important to the business. So, first, what does the business need? Second, what does this person want? Like, how do they want to grow? Do they want to be an individual contributor? Do they want to be a people manager? And then third, of course, where are their skill sets in alignment with those roles? And just making it super clear where they are in that journey, where the business is on that journey, what it might take to get there, and coaching them through that. And we have a whole slew of performance management discussions and that we go through. But at the end of the day, it's about being super clear on what are the expectations of the role and why does the role need that business, and does that individual want to go that path? Because we have all the different paths for you here at Clariti. So it's a really thorough process today, but certainly made a lot of mistakes along the way to get there.
And in what ways has equity been involved in talent retention over time? It's something you think about a lot. So I'd love to hear like where does that come into play as someone's doing really well in their career path, maybe exceeding, or has different demands or life circumstances happen, and you want to keep them involved and keep them excited. What's the ingredient and role that equity can play in that?
So our view on equity has definitely evolved over time. I think when we first joined the organization, and I think rightfully so, we were very kind of selective of where equity was kind of allocated across employees. And I think it was after our first year of really understanding the business that we introduced our first equity program. Um, I think over time, we really saw the kind of ownership that can come with equity when folks are kind of properly educated on equity. And so we made a decision to really open up an equity program starting at the senior manager level at the organization, which was kind of our view of it's kind of at that level that you start to really own KPIs of the business. You start to really own functions of the business. And you really have kind of direct decision-making authority over potential enterprise value. And so once you kind of get involved in that equity program, as kind of Jake and I mentioned, there's a lot of conversations we have around the explanation of enterprise value, what value creation means, how people's activities tie into the growth of the business, that tie into the growth of the value of the company, and how that equity does over time. And then we've kind of also introduced bands where as someone receives promotions through the business, they receive more and more equity. As someone's in the business for a longer period of time, they receive an equity refresh. And so over a 3, 5, 7, 10-year journey at our organization, there's more and more incentive to stay for longer because of kind of how that equity value grows consummate with the company. And again, just like hiring someone, at first you're just believing us, right? In year number 1, this is just a vision for what this means. But once you get to years 3, 4, and 5, and there starts to be people that have built meaningful equity positions in the organization and have demonstrated real growth in their equity value, that's when there starts to be a culture in the organization of people really seeing and feeling that value of the equity, and also candidly being motivated to drive equity value. And so I think that's been the story that equity's played in our organization.
And yeah, throughout all of this, you've clearly become like pretty effective internal communicators, and have emphasized to me just in other like chats how important comment like frequent communication has been. If I just shadowed each of you for a month, like what things would I notice communication wise with the way you communicate with the broader team or certain departments or groups? What do you think I would notice if I followed you around for a month?
Alex, open invitation. You are more than welcome to come on this journey with us.
That'd be super fun. That'd be super fun.
Would love to have you here. Yeah, I mean, at this point in the journey, it would definitely be different than year 1 of Cyrus and Jake running around trying to figure out how we build a great business and convince people to stay. Today, our communication has definitely evolved. So at the I guess I'll first focus it at the company level. Of course, Cyrus mentioned we're communicating the vision, mission, core values to every single employee. And that's not just when they join, but we're communicating it in every single all hands town hall. So you'll always see us go back to that 100 million, citizens served that Cyrus mentioned. It's something that we really rally everyone around because we are able to show, what was our progress since the last time we spoke? How many more citizens have we served? And that's just like rallying people around that vision, mission, core values. You'll get tired, sitting with Cyrus and I of hearing us talk about that because almost every single company meeting we are communicating that because it's so important to when someone wakes up in their day. Why are they here at the company? Of course, there's the having a job is important, but like the why they do their job is really important. And so you'll hear us communicating, and I think oftentimes over communicating that. And these days you'll see that communication in slides. You'll see it in a recording sent to you afterwards with bullets again on the vision and mission and where we are on track. You'll see it in our internal company database that we refer back to. So you'll see it everywhere. And as it comes to then more like, I'll call it people management level meetings, and you'll see Cyrus and I come in and talk more about those priorities that Cyrus is mentioning and where we are around them. But you'll actually see us trying to empower others to communicate it. So giving them the spotlight to, hey, here, why don't you drive where we are in this priority and work with this team and management group on that. And so I would say it's definitely become more of empowerment of our messaging and of our frameworks. And then in one-on-ones today, I mean, you'd see us hanging out, right? Like we're normal guys. And of course, like you want to connect with someone personally and on that personal level in any conversation we're having with anyone in the org. And as well, you want to make it super clear on where do we need to be in the org in, a mix of trying to inspire them on where we are. And also the clear like accountability measures that we need to uphold that individual to and what we need to see. And you'd probably come into some fun performance feedback conversations in that 1 month here. I mean, you absolutely would. And just the back and forth that takes place. But through it all, I would hope that you would feel the transparency that we have across the org at that full company level, people management level, or in our one-on-ones. But it's definitely evolved over time.
I was just smiling because I think Jake's kind of talking about like where we are today. And I think it'd be really funny to like see where we were like a year and a half ago. Because I think like to Jake's point, when we were 20 or 30 people, we could kind of just tell everyone something and they'd all communicate it to themselves and like that would kind of be it. Whereas like we kept that communication channel going, I think, for too long. And if you looked at us like a year or 2 years ago, we get questions like, where is the company going? And like, why are we doing this? And like, what's the purpose of this? And we're not really sure like why this was decided, or like we disagree with the decision and we were never like looped in for it. And so I think it took like a lot of feedback to Jake and I to recognize that, oh, for like communication to work at scale, to Jake's point, we need to deliver it in the town hall. We need the people managers to know. We need the written communication behind it. We need to check in on one-on-ones on how the communication was received and if we need to reiterate on it. And so I think just how deliberate we've needed to be with communication has significantly changed over the journey. So it'd be funny for you to see us like this month versus 2 years ago, because I think there's a lot of adjustments we needed to make a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it'd be wild to like record your first town hall like 5 years ago and then just like watch it like once a year just to see like how we do and where, how much have we improved since then, all that.
I was going through actually because another CEO was kind of asking for like what does the first like 6-month town halls look like, and Jake and I were like kings of like management consulting banking of having 7,000 words on like one slide with like all these charts and diagrams, and then I would just watch us like present it, and then I'd be like, any questions? I'd wait 1 second and we'd move forward. Versus now it's like, what is like the one point we're trying to articulate on this one slide with this like one message, and let's spend 10 minutes on that. And so, yeah, a pretty big change in communication from the early days.
Yeah, certainly a big change in a good way from what it sounds like, for sure. But thank you both for coming on the podcast. This has been super helpful. And I wish you luck in your onboarding call up next. Go break a leg. I'm sure it'll go well. So thank you for sharing your time in the meantime. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Great catching up, Alex. Good to see you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Think Like an Owner. If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review and telling a friend to help more folks find Think Like an Owner. I also want to thank our show's sponsors, Hood and Strong, Oberly Risk Strategies, and Ravix Group for supporting the podcast. For full episode transcripts and our weekly newsletter, please visit our website at tlaopodcast.com.